All right, in this lecture we're going to cover some of the concepts related to how stressors or stress can cause or exacerbate disease. Stress we think of as being, wound up because you have a test that day. But stressors can be physical, they can be psychological, they can be anticipatory. You can worry about things that haven't even happened yet. So there are, any stressor is something that throws you off of homeostasis that your body's going to have to respond to try to bring you back to kind of a healthy state. When a demand exceeds coping abilities, at least for that period of time, you're under stress. So your brain perceives something as being stressful, and again, you might not realize it. You may have some disease that is throwing your metabolism off, and your brain, though, has sensors that will pick that up, or it can be psychological. Normally, most stressors in our lives we're able to respond, react, and come back to center again, but they can become dysregulated, and if they do, it can cause disease or make diseases worse. So this researcher was looking for a sex hormone. He was looking for estrogens, or he was looking for prolactin, or he was looking for something, a new sex hormone, and he started injecting rats with ovarian tissue and found out that their bodies responded in a variety of ways. Some tissues hypertrophied, other tissues atrophied. They started getting bleeding ulcers. So something was going on that was making their tissues actually respond. So he called these stressors, and the term of the body's response was the general adaptation syndrome, the GAS syndrome, and he thought that stressors were actually physiologic, that if you thought something was bad, that wouldn't actually affect your body, it would just affect how you felt about things. His GAS syndrome, the alarm stage, when things first go off center and your body starts to respond, the body's defenses start to kick in. The adaptation or resistance stage was then whatever these defenses do, what increases or decreases in response to this, that's the adaptation that is supposed to, save you. The exhaustion stage is if these adaptations don't get you back to a livable level. And the effects of chronic adaptation winds up making you sick. So the alarm reaction here, we have ACTH coming from the brain. Remember, cortisol is a stress hormone. So are epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, is going to stimulate the adrenal gland to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that has this immediate fight or flight, thing where your eyes dilate and you breathe faster and your blood pressure goes up. And then ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol and other glucocorticoids, and that is a more long-term adaptation to stress. It causes a lot of metabolic changes that allows you to spare some glucose for future use. It mobilizes a lot of fats. You remember, it causes them to deposit in funny places on your body if it stays up too long, and so forth. A number of years later, they discovered that actually psychological stress does the same thing, that the physical responses to psychological stress are almost exactly the same as the physical responses to physical stress. You have a reactive response, so if the lion appears in front of you, that is a stressor, and you'll have all of the stress things that go along with it. Also, though, an illness, the illness of a child, whatever, those things will cause you to go through the GAS process. An anticipatory response will also do that. If you have a speech to give and you hate getting up in front of people, if you have your board's exam for medical school and you're working on it for months and months and months, and the closer you get, the more worried you get, you'll have these same physical responses as though you were sick. A conditioned response is a phobia. So if you already know that you're afraid of spiders, and it doesn't have to be, you can think about spiders, you can see pictures of spiders, you can see a spider, and suddenly it becomes a stressor for you. We're going to talk about how the stressors actually do this stuff, but they cause a variety of problems that have been found to make all of these things worse. People who are stressed out get atherosclerosis. Well, if you remember anything from heart disease and the creation of heart disease, it starts with an inflammatory response. Stress causes an inflammatory response. It causes an immune response, just like you had a physical problem. A psychological problem can do the same thing. So physical, psychological, your immune system kicks in and you have these local kind of allergic type responses. And that's where atherosclerosis begins in the heart, is the inflammation. Irritable bowel syndrome, the same. Ulcers, stress produce ulcers, cause you to, if you remember from the GI, histamine causes the release of stomach acid. Autoimmune disorders, delayed wound healing. Cortisol is an immunosuppressant. So delayed wound healing if you have prolonged stress. Reproductive dysfunction. People, women especially, will go into amenorrhea if they're overly stressed, either physically or psychologically. Depression, HIV. If you are HIV positive and you undergo a tremendous amount of stress, you're more likely to get AIDS because your immune system will be suppressed and damaged by the stressors. And we'll look at this in a couple of different ways, but this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis means that your hypothalamus is signaled by cytokines. Remember, stressors of any kind, the cytokine release goes to the hypothalamus and says we're under attack. The hypothalamus produces corticotropin releasing hormone, which causes the pituitary to release ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone, and that causes the adrenal gland to release cortisol. And so this axis of three things is what kicks up and causes a kind of a reflex that increases your stress response. Nervous system stimulates the adrenal gland, fight or flight, catecholamines, endocrine system, cortisol comes out, and the immune system, the histamine response, the inflammatory response kicks in. So here's a way of looking at it where stressors are coming through the blood, cytokines that are signaling a response of some kind. And so if you're signaling the nervous system, you're going to release epinephrine, norepinephrine, and even some corticotropin releasing hormone, which can be released from local sites because the tissue itself may want more immune response from the overall system. And the release of cortisol, histamine being stimulated from the mast cells, and it's going to cause this allergic response, this immune kind of response. It's going to cause a shift in the number of helper 1s versus helper 2s. The helper 1s are the kind of T helper cells that cause the killer cells, the cytotoxic Ts, to kick into gear. And the helper 2s are the ones that cause your B cells to make immunoglobulins, antibodies. And you shift in the direction of T2s. You reduce the ability of your killer cells and stuff to do their thing. This is why HIV people are in bad shape. If their helper 1s don't allow your killer cells and your cytotoxic Ts to be activated, then that drops down so much that they actually have a possibility of getting AIDS from their HIV. So we shift, and it throws off the balance between the T cells and the B cells. Psychoneuroimmunology is how psychological stress. We are probably more likely to have psychological stress these days than we are physical stress. We don't get attacked by lions very often. Now, of course, if you get cancer, that's a physical stress, but it's also a psychological stress because you're worried you're going to die of cancer. So anyway, the your conscious awareness of the problem, endocrine hormone release, the autonomic nervous system responses, all of these are going to feed into immune responses that put you at risk for additional disease. Kind of a reminder here, the neuroendocrine, the catecholamines coming from the adrenal medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine, they're binding to the alpha receptors. Alpha receptors cause vasoconstriction, make your blood pressure go up. Beta receptors, beta 1s increase heart function. Beta 2s dilate your lungs. So this fight or flight type of thing with perhaps chronically elevated blood pressure, if this is a long-term stressor. And so it mimics the direct sympathetic stimulation that comes from a sympathetic nerve, because the sympathetic nerves send out norepinephrine, which binds to these same receptors and causes these same responses. So whereas your nerves may not be stimulated if you're under stress, the adrenal gland is releasing all of these catecholamines, and they're causing that same kind of fight or flight response. Cortisol, remember, is the stress hormone. Cortisol causes a shift in your metabolic activity, and it causes immunosuppression. Hydrocortisone is cortisol. That's what you put on your arm when you have an inflamed spot that you want to get rid of the inflammation. So it has an immunosuppressive action, but at the same time it actually causes local tissue stimulation for inflammation by stimulating mast cells to make histamine. So your overall immune system may be kind of suppressed by this steroid that's going on. At the same time, it's causing an increased inflammatory response really locally. Long-term increase in acute inflammation locally, this is what I just said, while suppressing the overall immune response. And as I mentioned before, corticotropin-releasing hormone, which normally comes from your hypothalamus, can be released in small quantities locally by local tissues that are under attack. So if you have an autoimmune disease and your tissues are always under attack, or you have an acute inflammation and your tissues are under attack, they're going to release a little bit of CRH, and it will go through the blood to your pituitary, and next thing you know, your pituitary is increasing ACTH and increasing cortisol. So all of these things are tied together, and again, a short-term stressor can be dealt with. A long-term stressor means you're going to have long-term imbalances in all of these hormones. I mentioned the T2 shift. T1 cells promote the inflammatory response and turn on natural killer cells and cytotoxic Ts, those guys that directly go and kill cells by eating them or injecting, by injecting cytotoxins. Whereas the T2 cells have a suppressive inflammatory reaction while they're turning on the B cells to make antibodies for a longer-term response. Whether you memorize that or not is kind of irrelevant right here. You do have to remember that, natural killers kill directly and B cells make antibodies, sure. But the thing is, if you throw the balance too far off, that itself becomes an immunologic stressor. Other hormones in the body are altered by stress. Endorphins. We know about endorphins. They're a cytokine. Cytokines, interleukins, endorphins, some other substances that are designed to stimulate the brain and turn things on and off. Well, endorphins increase during stress. Overall, that's a good thing. Endorphins are designed to suppress pain. That's why they talk about the runner's high. If somebody's on the mile 20 of the marathon and everything is starting to hurt so bad, but the endorphin release suppresses pain. It's designed to suppress pain so that you can function long enough to save yourself. And so those are increased. Now, an over-release of endorphins isn't great because it might hide pain that needs to be dealt with. Interestingly, endorphins also inhibit blood pressure increases. So if you cut yourself and bleed out, you release endorphins that actually prevent you from bleeding out as fast temporarily. Growth hormone is suppressed with stress. Growth hormone, of course, makes you grow. It makes your muscles grow. It makes your bones grow. It also has a lot of metabolic effects. Raises your blood glucose by kind of suppressing your insulin effect. But kids who are under constant stress may have delayed growth. Oxytocin, a muscle contractor for childbirth and milk let down during lactation. But it also has some other effects, tends to be an anxiety reducer. I guess that's a good thing during childbirth. If there's anything that can reduce your anxiety, that would be a good thing. But oxytocin is released in response to cortisol. Remember the whole childbirth thing. Cortisol goes up. That causes oxytocin to be released. Oxytocin causes another contraction, which is stressor and causes the stress hormone cortisol to be released. More oxytocin, more contractions, and so forth. So anything that increases cortisol is going to increase oxytocin release. Testosterone is decreased. At the same time, growth hormone is decreased. Estrogens are increased. They tend to have a calming effect, kind of a anti-anxiety effect like oxytocin. Melatonin actually is increased slightly, but the response is blunted to it so that actually you can't respond to your own melatonin as well during stress. I guess the idea is that if you're under stress, if the enemies are around you, you don't want to fall asleep. You want to stay awake so that you can run away or fight or something. And so your ability to respond to melatonin is decreased, and therefore people under stress don't sleep very well. Physical stresses, pro-inflammatory cytokines. Remember when that allergic response or inflammatory response happens, your complement system, your local cells that are being damaged, even the bacteria that are being killed, release signaling molecules, cytokines, and they go and stimulate the immune system to do stuff. Well, it turns out psychological stress increases the cytokine release too. So you don't actually have to have an inflammation, you can just be really worried and you'll release cytokines. So the immune function, the T2 shift, everything happens under psychological stress just like it happens under physical stress. So how you cope with it, now part of this is physical. If your immune system is really healthy and it makes the right adjustments and solves the problem so that it goes away, that's coping. But what we generally refer to as coping is our own ability to address the stressor and compartmentalize it and move past it and make it work for us. People who cope really well can be multitaskers and they really like the feel of being stressed out in a newsroom or an air traffic controller or somebody. They like it. And if you like the feeling of the stress, the problems are not as big. If your worry about the stress is a stressor in itself. And so if you see it as a positive thing, now of course, you know, the stress of being an athlete, you know, playing in a big game, that's a big stressor, but you really look forward to it, you really like it. And therefore, it doesn't turn out to be a negative stressor in the way it would if you hated it. Some athletes, some musicians get so worried and stressed out before competitions, they throw up in the locker room before they have to go out and perform. Other people just find it a high. Stress can kill you if you don't cope right. HIV markers increase and the natural killer cells and stuff go down when you're super stressed out. When individuals try to hide their homosexuality and they're HIV positive, the stress of hiding their true nature makes them sicker. It's easier if they find a way to truly deal with their you know, maybe the reaction of their families or whatever, and not try to conceal it. PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, it has a similar effect. It throws off all of your immune markers, suppresses those T's, increases the B's. A husband whose wife dies is 50% more likely to die in the next few months. And a wife, it's 60%. The stress of having the spouse die and then having to cope on your own, if you haven't been used to that for 40 years, is enough to kill you. And hospitalization with a bad illness is just about as bad as having the spouse die. The stress of feeling helpless and not being able to do anything about it. And chronic illness of yourself. People who get burns and are in burn units for a long time. People who get cancer and they're, you know, sure they're going to die of cancer. The stress causes them to be sicker and live less. The coping mechanisms, you know, it's one reason hospice actually is showing to increase people's lifespan. People think, oh, I don't want to go into hospice. That's I'll just hurry up and die. No, the relief of stress, of not being in the hospital and being stabbed and poked and given treatments that probably won't work and worrying so badly, that stressor actually shortens lives. Now, occasionally the treatment will work and the person gets to live, but most people with terminal illnesses are being shown nowadays to actually live longer, not only be happier and less painful, but live longer with hospice than they do if they continue undergoing heavy-duty treatments. And your coping mechanism while you're going through this, if you see the treatment that you're getting as being a great thing, oh man, I can feel it killing my cancer. You see it as a savior, you're more likely to survive. It's like you're adding a placebo effect on top of the real effect. If people think that just being in there and getting that shot is the most horrible thing they ever had, oh, it's going to make me feel terrible, it's not going to do any good, they don't tend to do as well. Other coping mechanism things strategies can save your life. Physical activity is one of the best stress relievers there is. Going for a brisk walk, going for a run, going for a nice bike ride. Go to the gym and really get a good workout and do a nice slow stretch afterward. Relaxation exercises, yoga and meditation, and things that will relieve the stress are just overall good for you. And a social network, people that you know care about you. Making sure that these are in place if you're under stress is going to go a long way toward making you better. Or if your response to stress is to eat, and you're already heavy, smoke, drink. You know, a lot of people drink a lot of alcohol when they're stressed. Well, that sure doesn't make you, it doesn't make you become unstressed, and it doesn't make you live longer. So just a simple overview. Stressful life event, effective coping. You will get past the stressor and go back to a steady state. If you don't cope correctly, that same stressor, you might never get back to a steady state because you don't solve whatever the problem was that was causing you to be out of balance in the first place. And here's, if you perceive the treatment as a stressor itself, then your symptoms are going to get worse. If the treatment you perceive as being a savior, a wonderful thing, the symptoms will go down. And aging. There are a lot of things that go along with aging that add to the stress of your life. The very process of aging, everything hurts a little bit. It's hard to do what you want to do. You can't bend down and pick up stuff. You can't garden anymore. That's a stressor. All of the things you enjoy doing now hurt or they're difficult, and you perceive yourself as circling the drain, and your things are getting worse, and that becomes a stressor in itself. So not just the pain is a stressor, but how you feel about the pain becomes a stressor. Whereas if you're a kid and you break your leg, it's kind of cool walking around school with a cast on for a little while, and then, you know, everybody gets to ride on it and stuff. It doesn't feel the same way when you're 80. You have friends die. Your spouse dies. You have to move out of your home that you've been in your whole life and go to a smaller place or even go to a nursing home. Those things are big psychological stressors. A lot of your levels of hormones change too. Testosterone drops, estrogen drops. Remember, it had a calming effect. You have increased release of catecholamines and cortisol because you constantly have additional little inflammations and things that you don't have when you're young. The immune system gets depressed somewhat, partly because of the increased cortisol and partly because nothing else works that well anymore either, too. So it's easier to get sick and then harder to get well. Lipoproteins, your LDLs, HDL levels change. Your blood clots more easily. You're more likely to get strokes and heart attacks. And long-term free radical damage causes skin wrinkling, skin aging, and aging of the internal tissues as well. People tell me this, you know, I wouldn't know yet. I'm still a youngster. Stress and disease. Thank you.